baby is left to die on the banks of a flooding river. He shouldn't survive the night. Instead, a wolf finds him, and instead of killing him, she nurses him like one of her own. That baby grows up to find a city. That city becomes a kingdom. That kingdom becomes a republic. That republic becomes an empire so large that a soldier could walk from the fog of Scotland to the deserts of Syria and never leave Roman territory. And when that empire falls, the city doesn't disappear. It becomes the beating heart of an entirely new kind of power. A pope, not an emperor, ruling from the same 7 hills. And centuries after that, cannons fire on those same walls one final time, because a new nation wants that city as its capital too. This is the story of Rome, not just as an empire, but as a city that refused to stop reinventing itself. From 753 BC to 1870 AD, kings, senators, emperors, popes, generals, 26 centuries, one location. And here's the twist most people miss. The wolf and twin story? Almost certainly a myth. But what actually happened on those hills is, in some ways, even stranger. So let's start at the beginning, and separate the legend from what was actually dug out of the ground. The myth of the founding and what archaeology actually found the legend, as passed down by ancient writers like Livy and Virgil, goes like this. Twin brothers Romulus and Remus, descendants of the Trojan hero Aeneas, are exposed at birth, saved and raised by a she-wolf and a shepherd. As adults, the brothers argue over exactly where to build their city. Romulus wins, or rather, Romulus kills his brother, and on April 21, 753 BC, founds Rome on the Palatine Hill, opening it up as an asylum for outcasts and runaways from the surrounding region to build up his new population. It's a great story. It's also not really what happened. Archaeologists digging into the Palatine, Capitoline, and Esquiline hills have found something more interesting than a single founding moment. Evidence of small, separate pastoral villages, Latin and Sabine, that had been sitting on these hills since the Bronze Age. Rome wasn't founded in a day. It was stitched together, a process called Synoecism, as these independent hilltop communities gradually merged into one city over the 8th century BC. And the location wasn't an accident. Rome sat about 20 kilometers inland from the sea, right at a natural crossing point over the Tiber River at Tiber Island. That put it directly on the salt trade route, the Via Salaria, running between the coast and the interior. Add in the defensive high ground of the famous 7 hills overlooking the marshy river valley, and you've got a settlement with a built-in economic and military advantage before a single wall goes up. So Rome wasn't born from one man's vision. It was born from geography, and it just so happened that geography practically guaranteed this city would matter. But someone still had to run the place. So who were the actual kings of early Rome, and just how much of their story can we trust? The 7 kings and the birth and death of the monarchy. Roman tradition credits the city with 7 kings, each supposedly adding a new piece to the political and cultural puzzle. Romulus set up the original framework, an advisory senate of 100 clan elders, and 3 tribal divisions of the population. Numa Pompilius, his successor, is credited with standardizing Roman religion, the priesthoods, the Vestal Virgins, the office of Pontifex Maximus, even the 12-month calendar. Tullus Hostilius went the military route, crushing the rival city of Alba Longa and building Rome's first formal Senate house. Ancus Marcius pushed Roman territory out to the coast, founding the port of Ostia and building the first bridge across the Tiber. Then things get interesting because the next 3 kings were Etruscan, and the Etruscans transformed Rome from a village into a current city. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus introduced monumental engineering, draining the swampy valley between the Palatine and Capitoline with a massive sewer system, the Cloaca Maxima, to create what would become the Forum Romanum. Servius Tullius overhauled the entire social structure, replacing old tribal loyalty with a wealth-based census system that determined both taxes and military service. And the last king, Tarquinius Superbus, was a straight-up tyrant, executing senators and finishing the great temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline. Now here's where the consensus reality column of history disagrees with the legend. Modern historians think this list of 7 distinct kings, each cleanly credited with one specific institution, is likely a stylized simplification. Ancient historians projecting later republican institutions backward onto a much messier regal period to make the story feel neat. What's not disputed is how it ended. Tarquinius Superbus's son, Sextus Tarquinius, raped a noblewoman named Lucretia. Rather than living with the shame, Lucretia took her own life after naming her attacker. That single act of violence triggered a coup. The Roman nobility expelled the king, swore they would never again allow one man to rule Rome, and in 509 BC the Republic was born. A republic sounds stable in theory. But how do you actually build a government designed specifically to prevent any one person from becoming too powerful? That's the real engineering challenge Rome had to solve next. Engineering a republic, senate, magistrates, and assemblies. The Roman Republic's entire constitutional design was built around one obsession: never let a single man hold unchecked power again. At the top were two consuls, elected annually, holding equal and supreme command, but each one could veto the other, and any citizen could appeal a magistrate's judicial decision to the public. Below them sat the full career ladder, the cursus honorum: quaestors handling finances, aediles running public works and games, praetors handling justice and military command, and finally, consul. Every 5 years, censors were elected to run the citizen census and oversee public morality. And in a genuine military emergency, Rome could appoint a dictator, but only for 6 months maximum, non-renewable. The Senate itself wasn't a lawmaking body in the way we'd think of one today. It was a permanent council of former magistrates controlling the treasury, foreign policy, and religious affairs. And then there were the voting assemblies. The comitia centuriata, organized by military wealth classes, elected the top magistrates and could declare war. The comitia tributa, organized geographically, elected lesser officials and passed laws. And the concilium plebis, exclusively for the plebeian class, elected the tribunes and passed resolutions binding on everyone. It's a genuinely clever system on paper. Power split between magistrates, a permanent council, and voting citizens, each checking the others. But there's a problem baked right into it. This whole structure was designed by and for the patrician aristocracy. So what happens when the majority of Rome's population, the plebeians, decide they want an actual say? The conflict of the orders, how the plebeians fought back for nearly 2 centuries, from 494 to 287 BC, Rome was consumed by an internal struggle between the patrician aristocracy and the plebeian majority, a period historians call the conflict of the orders. The plebeians' weapon of choice was almost shockingly simple. They'd walk out. During military crises, when Rome desperately needed soldiers and workers, the plebeians would physically withdraw from the city, a secessio plebis, and refuse to return until they got concessions. It worked repeatedly. Out of these standoffs came the office of the tribune of the plebs, a position considered sacrosanct, whose holder could veto the actions of any other magistrate. Then came a string of legal landmarks: the 12 tables around 450 BC, Rome's first codified written laws, meaning the law was no longer just whatever the patrician elite said it was. The Lex Canulia in 445 BC legalized intermarriage between patricians and plebeians. The Lex Licinia Sextia in 367 BC required that at least one of the 2 consuls be a plebeian. And finally, in 287 BC, the Lex Hortensia declared that resolutions passed by the plebeian assembly were binding on all citizens, patricians included, without needing Senate approval. By 287 BC, the plebeians had, on paper, achieved full legal equality. Rome had just spent 200 years resolving its internal power struggle. Which was good timing because outside its walls, Rome was about to go to war with the rest of the Mediterranean. Conquering Italy, then conquering Carthage. Rome's military expansion happened in waves, and it started close to home. Between 509 and 264 BC, Rome methodically subdued its neighbors, the Volscians, the Equi, the Etruscans, capturing the Etruscan stronghold of Veii in 396 BC. It wasn't all smooth sailing. Gallic tribes under a chieftain named Brennus actually sacked Rome itself around 390 BC. But Rome rebuilt, strengthened its alliance network through the Latin League, ground down the Samnites across 3 separate wars, and finished off southern Italy after the Pyrrhic War. By 264 BC, Rome controlled the entire Italian peninsula. Then he looked across the water at Carthage, and the next 118 years became a fight for survival. The First Punic War, from 264 to 241 BC, won Rome control of Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. The Second Punic War, starting in 218 BC, is the one people remember because Hannibal Barca invaded Italy directly and nearly ended Rome for good. He crushed Roman armies at Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, and most devastatingly at Cannae in 216 BC, where over 50,000 legionaries were encircled and destroyed in a single day. Rome was staring at collapse. But instead of caving, Rome adapted its strategy, and under Scipio Africanus, took the fight to Carthage itself, defeating Hannibal decisively at the Battle of Zama in 202 BC. The Third Punic War, from 149 to 146 BC, was really just an execution. Rome destroyed Carthage entirely and annexed it as a province. At the same time, Rome was steamrolling the Hellenistic world, defeating Macedon twice, breaking the Seleucid Empire at Magnesia, destroying Corinth to bring Greece under control, and inheriting an entire kingdom, Pergamon, just through a will. By 133 BC, Rome dominated the Mediterranean. It should have been a triumphant moment. Instead, it was about to tear itself apart from the inside. Victory's hidden cost. How conquest broke the Republic. Here's the uncomfortable truth about all that expansion. It wrecked Rome's own social fabric. Wealthy elites bought up huge agricultural estates, latifundia, worked entirely by slave labor from conquered territories. Meanwhile, ordinary Italian farmers, the backbone of the legions, had spent years away fighting overseas wars, and came home to find their farms bankrupt and unworkable. They had nowhere to go but Rome itself, creating a growing, restless urban poor population with no land and no real economic footing. Two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, tried to fix this through land redistribution legislation in the late 2nd century BC. Both were assassinated by senatorial factions. And that's the moment political violence entered Roman governance for good. Then, around 107 BC, a general named Gaius Marius made a decision that would define the next century. He abolished the property requirement for military service. Suddenly, the landless poor could enlist, but their loyalty shifted from the state to whichever general could promise them land and pensions after their service. Rome now had professional armies loyal to individual men, not to Rome itself. You can probably guess where this goes. If soldiers are loyal to their generals instead of the government, what happens the first time a general decides he wants more power than the Constitution allows him to have? Civil war, Caesar, and the death of the Republic. The answer. Everything falls apart. Fast. First it was Sulla versus Marius from 88 to 82 BC. Sulla actually marched his own legions on Rome itself, something that should have been unthinkable, purged his political enemies, and made himself dictator to restore conservative control. Then came the first triumvirate, Julius Caesar, Crassus, and Pompey the Great, an unofficial power-sharing arrangement that completely bypassed the current constitution to control elections and military commands. When the Senate ordered Caesar to give up his command, he refused, and in 49 BC, he crossed the Rubicon River with his army, an act of open rebellion. He crushed Pompey at Pharsalus, and by 44 BC he was named dictator for life. He through calendar pushed reform and debt relief, genuinely popular moves, but a group of senators, led by Brutus and Cassius, saw only a king in Caesar's clothing, and assassinated him on the Ides of March, 44 BC. They thought killing Caesar would restore the Republic. Didn't. It just triggered another round of civil war. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, teamed up with Mark Antony and Lepidus in the Second Triumvirate, hunted down Caesar's assassins, and then, inevitably, turned on each other. It all came down to one naval battle. Actium, 31 BC. Octavian defeated the combined fleet of Antony and Cleopatra, and walked away as the single most powerful man in the Roman world. 500 years of republican government, and it ends with one man standing. So what does he actually do with that power? Does he crown himself king? No. He does something far cleverer. Augustus and the birth of an empire that pretends to be a republic in 27 BC, Octavian pulled off one of the great political sleight-of-hand moves in history. He didn't declare himself king. Romans still had a visceral hatred of that word. Instead, he took the title Augustus and called himself princeps, first citizen. On paper, the Senate, the magistrates, the assemblies, they all still existed. In reality, Augustus held supreme military command over the border provinces and permanent veto and legislative power through a lifetime grant of tribunician authority. The republic's shell remained. The substance was gone. This is the principality. Augustus used that power productively. establishing the Pax Romana, creating a permanent standing army and the Praetorian Guard, and undertaking a massive building program across Rome. His successors, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, had mixed results. Tiberius consolidated the finances but famously withdrew to the island of Capri. Caligula's autocratic excesses got him assassinated by his own guard. Claudius annexed Britain and expanded the civil service. And Nero ruled through the Great Fire of Rome, launched the first state persecution of Christians, and was eventually driven to suicide by military rebellion. When Nero died without an heir, Rome discovered something dangerous. Emperors could now be made by provincial armies, not just inherited or chosen in Rome. The year of the four emperors, 68 to 69 AD, saw Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian all claim the throne in rapid succession. Vespasian's Flavian dynasty stabilized things, restoring the treasury, suppressing the Jewish revolt, and starting construction on the Colosseum. His son Titus managed the disaster response to Vesuvius's eruption in 79 AD. Domitian expanded the frontier defenses but ruled so autocratically that his own court had him killed. Then Rome found something that actually worked for almost a century, choosing emperors by adoption and merit instead of bloodline. This is the era of the five good emperors: Nerva, who established the system; Trajan, who pushed the empire to its absolute maximum size; Hadrian, who pivoted from expansion to defense and built his famous wall in Britain; Antoninus Pius, who kept the peace; and Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor who spent his reign fighting off invasions while managing a devastating plague. It's often called the high-water mark of Roman civilization, which makes what comes next hit even harder. The 3rd century crisis. Rome almost doesn't make it after Marcus Aurelius. Things went sideways with the Severan dynasty, and then the wheels came completely off. When Emperor Severus Alexander was assassinated in 235 AD, it triggered 50 years of near-total structural collapse. Over 26 different military commanders were proclaimed emperor by their own troops during this period. The empire physically split apart into breakaway regimes in the west and east. Germanic tribes and Sasanian Persians hammered the borders. And the currency itself collapsed. Silver coinage was debased so aggressively that its current precious metal content dropped below 2%, triggering full-blown hyperinflation. This is, by any measure, an empire on the verge of dying. Didn't a series of tough, battle-hardened soldier emperors from the Illyrian frontier clawed the empire back together, and none more so than Aurelian, who reunified the fractured territories, earned the title Restorer of the World, and, tellingly, built massive new defensive walls around Rome itself. If Rome needs walls like that, everyone knows the old sense of invincibility is gone for good. So how do you stop this kind of collapse from ever happening again? The next emperor's answer was to essentially throw out the old operating system and build something completely different. Diocletian, Constantine, and a completely new kind of Rome Diocletian, who took power in 284 AD, looked at the last 50 years of chaos and concluded that the old republican-flavored principality was simply too fragile a system to survive. So he replaced it entirely with the Dominate, a system of open, absolute autocracy, no more pretending. And recognizing that one man couldn't realistically govern an empire this size, he split power 4 ways in the Tetrarchy: 2 senior emperors and 2 junior emperors, dividing the empire into eastern and western administrative halves. He also expanded the bureaucracy, reorganized the provinces, and overhauled taxation. Then came Constantine, who won the civil wars that followed Diocletian's retirement, and who made 2 decisions that reshaped the next 1,000 years of history. First, after his victory at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 AD, fought, according to tradition, under a Christian banner, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious tolerance to Christians, and later convened the Council of Nicaea to standardize Christian doctrine. Second, in 330 AD, he founded a brand new capital in the east, Constantinople, permanently shifting the empire's center of gravity away from Rome itself. Think about that for a second. The city of Rome is no longer even the capital of its own empire. So what happens to Rome itself when it's no longer the center of power? The fall of the West and the end of an empire through the 4th and 5th centuries, the Western Roman Empire just kept losing ground, economically, politically, and militarily, while wave after wave of Germanic peoples, fleeing the Huns, pushed into imperial territory. After Emperor Theodosius I died in 395 AD, The empire was permanently split into western and eastern halves for good. Rome itself, though no longer even the administrative capital of the West, that had already moved to Milan and then Ravenna, remained a powerful symbol. And that symbol got hit twice. In 410 AD, the Visigoths under Alaric sacked the city, the first time in 800 years that a foreign army had captured Rome. Then in 455 AD, the Vandals under Genseric did it again, spending 16 days systematically looting whatever wealth remained. By this point, real military power in the West had passed to barbarian generals commanding Roman armies. And in 476 AD, one of them, a Germanic warlord named Odoacer, simply deposed the last Western emperor, a teenager named, almost poetically, Romulus Augustulus, the same name as Rome's legendary founder. Odoacer didn't even bother naming himself emperor. He just sent the imperial regalia off to Constantinople and declared himself king of Italy. That's it. That's the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Not a dramatic final battle, but essentially a paperwork formality ending a slow decline that had been happening for decades. Rome the empire was over. But Rome the city was still standing on those same 7 hills. So what happens to a city after its empire dies around it? Medieval Rome. A city shrinks to a village. This is the part of Rome's story most people never hear, and it's brutal. Rome didn't stay a great city after 476 AD, it nearly disappeared. Odoacer's rule gave way to the Ostrogothic kingdom under Theodoric the Great, who actually governed fairly well from Ravenna and kept Rome's institutions functioning. But then the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian decided to reconquer Italy, launching the Gothic Wars from 535 to 554 AD. Rome changed hands multiple times between Byzantine and Ostrogothic forces, and the fighting was catastrophic. Invading armies deliberately cut the aqueducts to force the city into surrender. That single tactical decision changed Rome's shape for 1,000 years. Without water reaching the high ground, nobody could keep living on the famous hills anymore. The Palatine, Capitoline, and Esquiline, the historic center of the entire ancient world, were abandoned and reverted to pastureland and ruins. People crowded instead into the low-lying bend of the Tiber. This abandoned zone even got a name, the Disabitato, the uninhabited. A city that once held 1 million people had shrunk to somewhere around 35,000. With imperial administration essentially gone, someone had to keep the city functioning, and that someone turned out to be the Church. Pope Gregory the Great, around 600 AD, took over managing papal estates, organizing grain distribution, and negotiating directly with invading Lombards. The Bishop of Rome was becoming, out of sheer necessity, a civil ruler. That relationship became official in the 750s, when Pope Stephen II struck a deal with Pepin the Short, king of the Franks. Pepin defeated the Lombards and handed over conquered territory directly to the Pope, creating the Papal States, a sovereign territory ruled by the Church, which would last for over 1,100 years. Then, on Christmas Day, 800 AD, Pope Leo III crowned the Frankish king Charlemagne as Roman Emperor, creating the Holy Roman Empire, and setting up centuries of tension between popes and emperors over who actually held ultimate authority. Medieval Rome itself, meanwhile, was often a mess, dominated by feuding noble families like the Colonna and Orsini fighting for control of the papacy, occasionally sacked by rival powers. Things got even worse when the papacy itself left the city entirely. The Avignon papacy, from 1309 to 1377, moved the entire papal court to France, and without papal money or pilgrim traffic, Rome's population crashed to somewhere around 15,000 to 20,000 people. A popular uprising by Cola di Rienzo in 1347 briefly tried to restore Roman self-government, but collapsed into factional chaos. And when the papacy finally did return, it triggered the Western Schism, 40 years with rival popes simultaneously claiming legitimacy in both Rome and Avignon. So by the early 1400s, Rome is a depopulated, fought over, structurally damaged shell of its ancient self. How does it come back from that? The Renaissance, Rome rebuilds itself into a masterpiece. The resolution of the Western Schism in 1417 kicked off one of the most dramatic transformations in the city's history. Renaissance popes set out, quite deliberately, to rebuild Rome into the visual and spiritual capital of Western Christianity. Pope Nicholas V started the systematic urban renewal, founding the Vatican Library and ordering the old, decaying St. Peter's Basilica demolished and rebuilt from scratch. Sixtus IV built the Sistine Chapel and founded the Capitoline Museums. And Julius II went even further, consolidating papal territory through current military campaigns, clearing the site for the new St. Peter's, and commissioning an almost unbelievable roster of talent. Bramante to design the new basilica, Michelangelo to paint the Sistine ceiling, and Raphael to fresco the papal apartments. This golden age got violently interrupted in 1527. Unpaid mercenary troops serving the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, a mix of German and Spanish soldiers, breached Rome's walls and subjected the city to months of looting and killing. Pope Clement VII barely escaped, fleeing through a fortified secret corridor to Castel Sant'Angelo. The sack of Rome effectively ended the high Renaissance in the city overnight. But Rome had proven more than once now that it could rebuild from catastrophe. The question was, what would it rebuild into next? Counter-Reformation Rome. Building the Baroque city we recognize today, the Protestant Reformation had shaken the Catholic Church to its core, and the Church's answer was the Counter-Reformation, and Rome became its showpiece. Pope Sixtus V, working with architect Domenico Fontana, cut long straight avenues through the medieval tangle of the city, connecting the great pilgrimage basilicas and re-erecting ancient Egyptian obelisks as landmarks to guide the pilgrims flooding into town. Then came the Baroque explosion. Gian Lorenzo Bernini designed the sweeping colonnade that embraces St. Peter's Square, the massive bronze canopy over the high altar, and the fountain of the Four Rivers in Piazza Navona. His rival, Francesco Borromini, brought wildly inventive geometric churches to the city. Much of what tourists photograph in Rome today, the fountains, the piazzas, the sweeping approach to St. Peter's, is Baroque Rome, built by a church determined to provide its power and permanence through architecture. For over 250 years, this papal monarchy ran the city with total authority. But history had one more massive upheaval waiting, and it was coming from France. Napoleon arrives, and the papacy's grip starts to crack in 1798. French revolutionary troops under General Berthier marched into the Papal States and occupied Rome. Berthier declared a secular French-style Roman Republic. Pope Pius VI was taken prisoner and exiled to France, where he died in captivity the following year. This first experiment collapsed within a year, but the message was clear. The old assumption that the Pope automatically ruled Rome was no longer untouchable. Napoleon himself finished the job in 1809, formally annexing the Papal States into the French Empire and declaring Rome a free imperial city. Pope Pius VII was arrested and exiled until 1814. Under French administration, secular legal codes were introduced, and archaeological excavation actually expanded in the ancient Forum. After Napoleon's fall, the Congress of Vienna in 1815 restored the Papal States to traditional clerical rule. But you can't put the genie fully back in the bottle. Underground nationalist movements, the Carbonari, and a growing wave of Italian unification sentiment, the Risorgimento, kept building beneath the surface. That pressure was building toward something. And in 1848, all across Europe, it exploded at once. Revolution, a Second Republic, and French guns restoring the Pope in 1848. Following the assassination of his own prime minister, Pope Pius IX fled Rome in disguise. In February 1849, a democratically elected assembly declared the Second Roman Republic, run by a triumvirate that included the nationalist theorist Giuseppe Mazzini, with military command in the hands of Giuseppe Garibaldi. Pius IX appealed to Catholic Europe for help, and French President Louis Napoleon Bonaparte responded, sending troops that besieged Rome and, despite fierce resistance from Garibaldi's forces, broke through the city's defenses in July 1849. The Republic was overthrown, and a French garrison was stationed permanently in Rome to protect the Pope. For the next 2 decades, that French garrison was the only thing standing between the Papal States and full Italian unification. So what would it take to finally remove it? The breach of Porta Pia, the final fall of Papal Rome through the 1860s, the Kingdom of Sardinia, led by King Victor Emmanuel II and Prime Minister Cavour, unified nearly all of Italy, proclaiming the Kingdom of Italy in 1861 and immediately declaring Rome its capital, even though Rome itself was still off-limits, protected by that French garrison. Then, in July 1870, the Franco-Prussian War broke out. Napoleon III needed every soldier he had for the fight against Prussia, so he pulled the French garrison out of Rome. When France was crushed at the Battle of Sedan, papal protection was gone for good. King Victor Emmanuel II tried one last time to offer a peaceful, face-saving entry of Italian troops under the pretense of protecting the Pope. Pius IX flatly refused. So on September 11, 1870, the Royal Italian Army, under General Raffaele Cadorna, crossed into papal territory. They advanced almost entirely unopposed until they reached the ancient Aurelian walls surrounding Rome itself. The same Aurelian walls had built 6 centuries earlier during Rome's darkest crisis. On the morning of September 20, 1870, at 5 a.m., Italian artillery opened fire on the walls near Porta Pia. After a 3-hour bombardment, they blew a 30-meter breach straight through the ancient fortifications. Italy's elite infantry, the Bersaglieri, poured through the gap. Pope Pius IX ordered his commander, General Kanzler, leading a defense force of just over 13,000 men, including the Swiss Guard and the Papal Zouaves, to put up only token resistance, enough to demonstrate that the church yielded only to force, not by choice. The fighting cost 49 Italian and 19 papal soldiers their lives. Kanzler surrendered shortly after the breach opened. 2 weeks later, a plebiscite saw the people of Rome vote to join the Kingdom of Italy. On February 3, 1871, Rome officially became the capital of unified Italy, ending 1,114 years of the papacy's direct political rule over the city. Pius IX withdrew behind the Vatican's walls, declared himself a prisoner in the Vatican, and refused to recognize the new Italian state at all. A standoff, known as the Roman Question, that wouldn't be resolved until 1929, 26 centuries. Kings, republic, emperors, popes, and finally a modern nation-state. One city on the same 7 hills the entire time. What Rome actually left behind before we wrap up? It's worth stepping back and looking at some of the details that don't fit neatly into the timeline, but explain just how deep Rome's fingerprints go. Start with the numbers. At its peak around 117 AD, the city of Rome held roughly 1 million people. A population density so extreme it would not be matched again in that same city for over 1,000 years. But life inside that population was brutal by modern standards. Life expectancy at birth is estimated at only 22 to 25 years. Roughly 30% of infants died in their first year, and over half of all children died before turning 10. High population wasn't a sign of comfortable living. It was sustained by extremely high birth rates simply outpacing extremely high death rates. And then there's what's still buried under the modern city. In the Roman Forum, archaeologists uncovered the lapis niger, a black marble marker covering an archaic altar and stone inscribed in an old form of Latin that actually contains the word for king. Physical proof the monarchy really existed. Just outside the old center, there's Mount Testaccio, an entire artificial hill, 35 meters high, made from an estimated 53 million broken olive oil jars. Each one stamped with details that let historians reconstruct Rome's entire import economy. And beneath St. Peter's Basilica itself, excavations ordered in the 1940s found a 1st-century Roman cemetery containing a shrine that lines up with the ancient tradition that St. Peter himself was buried on that spot. And Rome's influence did not stop at its own borders, or even at its own collapse. When American founders sat down to design a new government centuries later, they were reading Polybius's analysis of the Roman Constitution, its balance between executive consuls and aristocratic Senate and democratic assemblies, and built the U.S. Senate and the entire checks and balances system directly on that model. The presidential veto traces straight back to the Roman tribune's power of intercessio. Even George Washington's decision to voluntarily give up military power echoed the Roman legend of Cincinnatus. Look at the architecture. Capitol Hill is named after Rome's Capitoline Hill. The Lincoln Memorial carries carved Roman fasces, and Thomas Jefferson modeled the Virginia state capitol directly on an actual Roman temple. Even the Supreme Court has cited Roman legal doctrine in real cases dealing with property, admiralty law, and the presumption of innocence. Rome didn't just fall. It got absorbed into the DNA of the world that came after it. So that's the full arc, from a she-wolf myth and a handful of hilltop villages, all the way to cannons breaking through an ancient wall in 1870. But here's the thing, we told this whole story in broad strokes, and there's one chapter in here that deserves its own deep dive. The fall of the Western Empire itself. How does the most powerful state in the ancient world go from ruling the entire Mediterranean to a teenage emperor being quietly deposed with no one even bothering to replace him? If you want to understand exactly how that collapse happened, step by step, that's the next video you should watch. And if you want more of Rome's story told this way, the myths, the archaeology, and the moments history books usually skip, hit subscribe because this channel is only getting started.